The key didn't work. I stood on the front porch of the house. I grew up in the same porch where my mother used to sit in her green plastic chair every single evening, and I turned my key in the lock 3 times. Nothing. I thought maybe I had the wrong key. I dug through my bag, my hands still shaking from 2 days of airports and funeral parlors, and politely accepting casseroles from neighbors I hadn't seen in 15 years. I tried again. The door didn't open. And then my neighbor Gerald Marsh walked across his yard and said 6 words I have never stopped hearing. "Honey, I own this house now. I want to be clear about the moment I'm describing. It was a Tuesday. I had buried my mother 41 hours earlier. I was wearing the same black dress I'd worn at the graveside, because I had not slept enough to remember to change, and Gerald Marsh, who I had known my entire life, who used to wave at me from behind his lawnmower every Saturday morning, was standing on what was apparently his property telling me I needed to leave. "My name is Vivian Calloway. I'm 43 years old. And this is the story of how I lost my mother and my childhood home in the same week, and how I found out my brother was the reason for both. Let me take you back to the beginning because none of this makes sense without it. My mother, Dorothy Calloway, was 71 years old when she got sick. She'd lived alone in our childhood home in Millhaven, Ohio for 11 years ever since my father passed. The house was a modest 3-bedroom on Sycamore Street, nothing fancy, but it was paid off and it was hers. She'd told me more than once that when she was gone, she wanted it to go to me and my brother equally. There was no formal will. My mother was a woman who trusted people, especially her children, and she'd never thought much about legal paperwork. My brother Darren is 3 years younger than me. We were never particularly close as adults. He stayed in Millhaven. I moved to Atlanta for work about 15 years ago, and we had the kind of sibling relationship that's maintained more by holiday phone calls than by actual closeness. He had a habit of borrowing money and being vague about paying it back. He worked irregular jobs. He always had some idea or some plan that never quite materialized. But I didn't think badly of him. He was my brother. I assumed he was doing his best. When my mother was diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer in March, I flew home every 6 weeks. I coordinated her care, arranged for home health aides, managed her medications, paid for things her insurance didn't cover. Darren was local, so he handled the day-to-day visits. He sat with her, brought her food, watched television with her in the evenings. I was grateful to him for that. Genuinely. She passed on a Friday in October. I flew in Saturday morning. We arranged the service together. Darren seemed broken up about it in the way you'd expect, quiet, teary, not eating much. I remember thinking it was one of the few times in our adult lives that we were truly on the same team. We buried our mother on Monday. And Tuesday morning, I drove back to the house to begin the process of going through her things. That was when I found out my key no longer worked. Gerald told me the house had come up for auction 6 weeks earlier. There had apparently been a county tax lien on the property from several years back. Something my mother hadn't resolved, and once the lien hit a threshold, the county had scheduled a forced sale. Gerald said he'd been watching the property listing for months. He bid on it. He won. The sale had finalized 3 weeks before my mother even passed. I stood there on that porch trying to understand what I was hearing. My mother had been alive when the house sold. The house was gone before she was, and my brother had known. That was the thought that crept in slowly, then hit me all at once. Darren lived 10 minutes away. He visited her every week. The county sends notices. There are certified letters. How does a tax lien on your elderly mother's house go to auction without the son who sees her every week knowing about it? I called him from the car. His phone went to voicemail. I drove to his apartment. He answered the door in sweatpants, looking like he hadn't slept, and I told him what Gerald had said. I watched his face, and I want to be precise here. He did not look confused. He did not look surprised. He looked the way a person looks when they've been caught, that brief, terrible stillness before they start constructing a story. He told me he'd found out about the lien a few months ago but hadn't wanted to worry me or our mother. He said he'd been trying to find a way to pay it off. He said it had all moved faster than he expected, and by the time the auction was announced, it was too late. Every sentence felt like a lie, but I didn't have the evidence yet to say so. I drove back to my hotel. I spent 3 hours on the phone with the county recorder's office, the tax department, and 2 attorneys. What I learned in those 3 hours rearranged my entire understanding of what my brother was. The lien had been placed 18 months ago. Notices had been sent to the house address which Darren visited weekly. The auction had been publicly listed for 63 days before it occurred. Not a fast-moving bureaucratic surprise. A long, slow, well-documented process during which my brother had received multiple pieces of mail about it and said nothing to me. But that wasn't even the worst part. One of the attorneys helped me pull property records, and that's where I found the second piece. 6 months before the auction, Darren had taken out a personal loan of $22,000, using our mother's property as informal collateral, not a formal mortgage, but a private lending arrangement through a small local company that specialized in non-traditional, secured loans. He had used our mother's house, which was not legally his, to borrow against as leverage to get cash. The lender had been one of the parties monitoring the lien situation. They had a claim on any proceeds. I sat in that hotel room with my black dress still on, and a legal pad covered in notes, and I thought my brother didn't just fail to warn me. He had a financial reason to let the house sell. If you enjoy real drama stories like this, consider subscribing. New stories every week. The next morning I went to see Gerald Marsh, not to confront him but because I needed to understand the full picture. Gerald is the kind of man who thinks of himself as a fair dealer. He was almost apologetic. He said he'd assumed the family knew that it was a public auction, that he'd even mentioned to Darren a few weeks before the sale that he was planning to bid. He paused when he said that. He seemed to realize what that implied. I asked him directly, did Darren ever tell him I didn't know? Gerald looked at his boots for a long moment. Then he said yes. He said Darren had come to see him about 2 weeks before the auction date. He'd told Gerald that I was out of the picture, that I'd moved away, and wasn't interested in the property, that the family had agreed it was fine to let it go. Gerald said Darren had asked him, not demanded, just asked whether Gerald might be willing to give him a little something for the heads up, since he was the one who'd made sure the bid process went smoothly. Gerald said he'd given him $500. A finder's fee, he called it. He thought it was strange but not illegal. $500. That was what my brother decided his silence was worth. While I was flying back and forth to care for our dying mother, while I was paying for her aids and her medications and her dignity, while I cried at her graveside in this same black dress, my brother had pocketed $500 to make sure a neighbor could buy our childhood home without me ever knowing it was for sale. I had to pull my car over on the way back to the hotel. I couldn't see the road. The days that followed were some of the strangest of my life. I was trying to grieve my mother and simultaneously understand the full legal scope of what had happened, and those two things kept colliding in exhausting ways. An attorney confirmed that the auction had been technically legitimate. The county had followed all required procedures, the sale had been properly advertised, and Gerald had purchased the property in good faith. There was no straightforward way to reverse the sale. But Darren's loan, that was a different story. The loan he'd taken out was structurally fraudulent. He had represented our mother's property as available collateral without authorization. She had not signed off on it. There was no power of attorney, nothing. My attorney said that was actionable. And the finder's fee, while small, documented that he had received money in exchange for facilitating a transaction he had concealed from a co-heir. My attorney also raised something I hadn't considered: the estate. My mother died without a formal will, which in Ohio meant her estate, including any cash accounts, personal property, and any residual interest she might have had, would pass by intestate succession to her surviving children equally. Darren had not mentioned any of this to me in the days after her death. He hadn't asked me about bank accounts. He hadn't brought up the estate at all. I started to wonder if he'd already been moving things. I hired an estate attorney. What she found over the following 2 weeks made the $500 finder's fee look trivial. My mother had a savings account with approximately $14,000 in it. Darren had been added as a joint account holder 2 years ago. My mother had done this to make it easier for him to help with her bills. In the weeks before and after her death, he had made a series of withdrawals. Not all at once, that would have been obvious. Small amounts every few days over about 6 weeks. By the time I knew to look, the account had $847 in it. He had taken nearly the entire thing. I called Darren that night. Not to give him warning, but because I needed to hear his voice when he tried to explain it. He answered on the second ring. He sounded tired. I told him I knew about the savings account. I told him I knew about the loan. I told him I knew about the conversation with Gerald and the $500. I said all of it calmly, the way you speak when you've already made your decision, and the conversation is just a formality. There was a long silence. Then he said, "Viv, you don't understand what my life has been like." I told him I didn't need to understand his life. I needed him to understand that I was going to the police in the morning. He started talking quickly then. He said he was in debt. He said he'd borrowed money from people who weren't patient about being repaid, and the $22,000 had covered most of it but not all of it. He said he'd planned to pay the savings account back before I found out. He said he hadn't meant for it to go this far. He said, and this is the part I still think about, he said, "Mom would have wanted me to be okay." I hung up. "Would you have stayed on that call?" I couldn't. There is a point beyond which someone else's desperation stops being an explanation and becomes an accusation, as if his debts were supposed to be my problem too, as if my grief was supposed to absorb his theft. I couldn't hold both things. If you found this story worth watching, a like really helps the channel. It means a lot. I filed a police report the next morning. Not for the house. The attorney had confirmed that reversing the sale was unlikely, without proving Gerald had acted in bad faith, which the evidence didn't support. But for the unauthorized loan against the property, for the account withdrawals, for the finder's fee, which my attorney believed could constitute a form of financial elder abuse given that our mother had still been alive and technically owned the property at the time, the investigation took 7 months. During that time, Darren did not reach out to me. Not once. No apology, no explanation. Nothing. I don't know if he was advised by a lawyer not to, or if he simply didn't feel the need. Either way, the silence told me everything I still needed to know about how he saw what he'd done. What kept me sane during those months was something smaller than justice. I went through my mother's belongings. Gerald was remarkably decent about giving me time to retrieve her personal items before he began renovating. I found her recipe box, her photo albums, a tin of costume jewelry she'd been collecting since the 1970s. I found a handwritten letter she had started and never finished addressed to both of us that talked about wanting us to take care of each other. She'd stopped writing mid-sentence. I don't know when she'd started it or why she'd stopped. I kept it. I didn't show Darren. The district attorney's office eventually charged Darren with 2 counts: fraudulent use of another's real property and financial exploitation of an elderly or disabled person. The second charge required establishing that he had systematically taken funds from our mother's account during a period when she was physically vulnerable and reliant on his assistance, which the withdrawals timeline combined with her medical records supported. He pleaded guilty to the lesser charge, received a suspended sentence, and was ordered to make restitution of just over $16,000. I did not attend the hearing. My attorney went on my behalf. The restitution, if I'm honest, felt almost beside the point. The money doesn't give me back what the house represented. It doesn't fix what those 7 months of investigation cost me in time and legal fees and sleep and peace. And it doesn't answer the question I come back to most, which is simpler and older than any of the legal language. At what point did Darren decide I didn't matter? Not as a co-heir, not as a creditor, as a sister. At what point did his debts outweigh his love, or whatever version of love was supposed to exist between us? Was there ever a version of him that would have called me before the auction? Was there a night when he almost did and then didn't? I've thought about this a lot. I've decided I'm not going to get an answer that satisfies me, so I've stopped looking for one. What I know is this: my mother spent her whole life trusting people to do the right thing. She trusted Darren because he was nearby, and she could see him. She didn't know he had a loan out on her house. She didn't know her savings account was being drained. She died believing her children would sort things out between them. In one sense, we did. Just not the way she imagined. I live in Atlanta. I visit Millhaven once a year for the anniversary of her death. When I drive down Sycamore Street, I can see that Gerald has repainted the house. It's a pale yellow now, which is nothing like the white it was when I was growing up, but it looks well kept. He added a new railing on the porch where my mother's green chair used to sit. I don't stop. I don't knock. The house belongs to him legally, but the memories in it, those are still mine. Darren couldn't sell those. He couldn't borrow against them. He couldn't pocket a finder's fee for them. Those I kept. And I think about what it means to protect something that matters. Really protect it, not the way my brother protected his debts, but the way my mother tried to protect us every single day of her life. She gave everything she had to 2 children, and one of them spent her last years treating her home like a financial instrument. I think about the letter she never finished. I think she knew somewhere that she needed to say something. That something between us was fragile in ways she could feel but couldn't name. I wish she'd had the chance to finish it. I wish a lot of things. But mostly I think about that Tuesday. The porch. The key that didn't work. The moment before I understood, when it was still possible to believe there had just been some mistake, some miscommunication, some simple thing that would resolve itself. I didn't know then that I was standing at the end of a very long betrayal. I know now. And knowing even when it hurts is always better than staying blind.